and it used to be philosophers were caught in a kind of dilemma about how to answer this. One way was to go with Descartes and go dualistic, and to say the mind is this mysterious, unobservable realm that's non-physical, and at best we can make a leap, an analogical leap from our own case. We know we have a mind, and we say, well, you often act the way I do, you must have a mind too. It's a very weak analogical argument. There's an N of one, me. I mean, it's just as likely that you're all, well, in this group, robots might be conscious. So it's just as likely that you're all a non-sentient mechanisms of some kind as you are that you have a mind. So that's a bad option. The other option was the early 20th century behaviorism, which is the view that the mind is visible. Basically, what it is to have a belief or a desire is to act in a certain way. But that's problematic as well because, of course, there are actors who don't have the beliefs and desires they pretend to have in the behavior, and of course there are Stoics. There are Stoic Marines who are in excruciating pain while being tortured by terrorists and don't show any emotion at all, right? So the connection between mind and behavior is not as close as that. So he proposed this third option, and this, he, being a philosopher of science, he thought, wait a second, maybe mental states can be in human bodies the way molecular states are in gases. Okay, they're not observable, they're theoretical posits. They're not observable, they're theoretical posits, but they're not mysterious. You know, molecules aren't these mysterious ghosts, like a ghost in the machine. Molecules are real physical objects. We just can't see them directly, we have to theoretically infer them. So he saw, if we treat mental states as unobservable causes in the way that science treats other theoretical states, we can get out of this dilemma and solve the problem of other minds. How do I know that you have another mind? So I act like a scientist and I propose a hypothesis an explanatory hypothesis meant to explain your behavior. This hypothesis is couched in terms of unobservables, but not mysterious states, in the same way as hypotheses about molecular states explain the behavior of the classic thermodynamic behavior of gases, for example. So that's Wilfrid Sellers' idea, and then it's taken up by famous developmental psychologists, in particular Alison Gopnik, who argues that you can actually explain the ontogeny of human social cognition by literally taking children to be scientists, gradually learning to infer mental states. And the stage of ontogeny, I mean, it's a very strict analogy for her, parallel stages of scientific discovery. She basically takes a Kuhnian view of the history of science, where you have these long periods of normal science punctuated by these scientific revolutions, and you get new periods of normal science, and she interprets the entire ontogeny of human social cognition in this way. Okay, children start off as mere desire psychologists. They do a lot of normal science as desire psychologists. Then there's a revolution. Oh, people also have beliefs, and that inaugurates a whole new paradigm. So,
Who is she?
Alison Gopnik. Okay, so that's the background. Now, why do people like theory of mind? Well, one motivation is this comes from Andy Whiten. He's a comparative psychologist at St. Andrews University who talks about whether non-human animals have theory of mind. And he has this nice little, this has engendered a lot of debate about whether he's right or not. But he has this nice idea that suppose we were just driven by behaviors. We were just trying to predict each other's future behavior based on present and past behavior. Then you would have to memorize all of these independent associations. So B shows fear expression, and then there's all these three different things that could happen. And then B runs away from A, same three different things. There's a lot of redundancy, but if you code these different behavioral expressions in terms of an internal state, the feeling of fear, Whiten argues that gives you a lot of information compression. It makes the task more efficient. So that's one reason people were persuaded by the idea that theory of mind is actually a really handy cognitive mechanism to have in anticipating the behavior of your conspecifics. Here's some classic quotations. David Lewis, probably one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, writing in his book Convention, which is about, he sees conventions as solutions to coordination problems. And he just assumes, largely without argument, that we do this using a theory of mind. He thinks a simulation version. So to quote him, we may achieve coordination by acting on our concordant expectations about each other's actions. We may acquire these expectations by putting ourselves in the other fellow's shoes to the best of our ability. If I know what you believe about what matters of fact that determine the likely effects of your alternative actions. And if I know your preferences among possible outcomes, and I know that you possess a modicum of practical rationality, then I can replicate your practical reasoning to figure out what you will probably do so that I can act appropriately. So there's a philosophical application of theory of mind to solving a coordination problem. But it continues with us. Agnieszka Kovacs over at Central European University, probably one of the best developmental psychology labs in the world, in a fairly recent paper arguing that even 7-month-old infants represent beliefs of other people, writes this, again unargued, this is part of the preface. Humans are guided by internal states such as cultural beliefs. Without an ability to infer others' mental states, society would be hardly imaginable. Social interactions from collective hunting to playing soccer to criminal justice critically depend on the ability to infer others' intentions and beliefs. Such beliefs are also at the foundation of major evolutionary conundra. For example, the human aptitude at inferring mental states might be one of the crucial preconditions for the evolution of the cooperative social structure in human societies. Okay, so this idea that we're able to infer each other's mental states using a theory of mind, many people see this as key to what's distinctive about human evolution, which is our ability to cooperate in large groups. Okay, but when you look at a lot of these discussions, there's actually two different ideas of theory going around, and I think this leads to a lot of problems down the road. So if we follow Sellers and the philosophy of science and understand theory in the sort of precise way in which philosophers of science have understood it, a theory is an unobservable, theoretically inferred, causally active domain that explains observable effects. So viruses, part of a theory of the symptomology of certain forms of illness, bacteria, molecules, fundamental particles. And Sellers had this idea that in a theory we use an observable domain of artifacts as a model. So think about the molecules that you get in high school with those springs, you know, the little spheres. That's an observable domain that we use to model this unobservable domain, actual molecules and actual gases. Sellers thought, when it comes to theory of mind, for him, he thought language was already on the scene. And so we use sentences, public language sentences, which are observable, as model, and how they interact with each other, what kind of inferences you can make, as a model of mental states, right? I believe that it is raining. Notice you're using the sentence, it is raining, right? To model an internal state, the belief, okay? So that was Sellers' idea. But there's a much weaker sense of theory when you look at actual psychologists. Actual psychologists, usually when you ask them, why do you think it's a theory? They say something like this. Well, many behavioral ways of being angry, happy, sad, believing that the apocalypse is imminent. There are many behavioral ways of accomplishing these mentalistic categories. So what that shows is that the mental categories are more abstract than behavioral categories. And usually when they say knowledge is theoretical, they just mean it's abstract. They don't necessarily mean it's this unobservable, theoretically inferred, causally active domain. And here's what I have in mind here. There are many examples of abstract concepts which are not theoretical in this sense. They're not causal, they're not hidden causal states, causally compared states. Being to the north of, being in front of, being to the left of, being circular, being heavier than. These are all abstract. These can all be realized in indefinitely many different observable configurations, by indefinitely many different kinds of physical observable objects. Yet they're not theoretical entities in this sense. They're not in some kind of hidden realm causing stuff to happen, okay? So there's a bit of an ambiguity when we say there's a theory of mind. Do we just mean that beliefs are more abstract, or desires are more abstract than observable behaviors? Or do we mean that they're part of this internal domain? Okay, so keep that in mind. Another thing I want you to keep in mind is that explaining behavior is different from anticipating behavior. Okay? Even if we need a theory to explain behavior, it doesn't follow that this is the best way to anticipate behavior in everyday life, right? Joint action might not rely on the same representational resources as folk explanations of behavior, but conflating these tends us to suppose that joint action requires theory of mind. There's no doubt that if you ask people to explain why someone did something, they will refer to mental states, they will refer to theory of mind. It doesn't follow from that that when they get along with people, when they anticipate their behavior, they're also employing the same representational resources. The task of explaining something is very different from the task of anticipating it. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so here are some reasons I think the theoretical model might be problematic. At least the full-blown notion of theory as an unobservable domain of causally efficacious fact. The key idea to theory is that the observed state and the mapping between observed states and theorized states is many to many, okay? Fever, what does it mean? Fever is the observed state. Is it bacterial or is it a viral infection? Tears, observed state. Is it joy, is it sadness? HIV positive, theoretical state. Do we anticipate normal health or failing health? Anger, raised voice or lowered voice. Again, either of these are compatible, right? Given other background assumptions. So there's this mismatch between appearance and reality that's built into the theory model. And I think that's potentially problematic for this reason. It leads to the problem of holism. That you can't go from something you observe to the theory or from your theoretical posit to a prediction about observations without filling in a potentially indefinite list of background assumptions. So here's just a toy example. Subject is holding an umbrella in the rain. We know that the subject wants to stay dry. Prediction, subject will open the umbrella. But what if subject does not believe it's raining? Subject does not believe umbrella works. Subject believes opening umbrella will trigger a bomb. Subject has been paid to keep umbrella closed. Subject wants to subvert interpreter's predictions, etc., etc. You can generate this list infinitely. So there's a risk of computational intractability if you're trying to use a theory in the classical sense to anticipate in real time behavior. Okay, there's just a lot of possibilities that have to be ruled out before you come to the actual hypothesis. Plus, it doesn't seem like we go through anything like a search like this when we successfully anticipate other people's behavior. Okay, so here are some of the experimental paradigms that have led people to posit theory of mind, and of course the classic one, I think, as you pointed out, was the false belief task. In the classic false belief task, in the verbal version, which is you ask a child to anticipate the behavior of a puppet who was out of the room when the other puppet hid the toy the puppet was playing with. It's verbal, okay? Usually not passed until age 4. A lot of individual and cultural variability. There's Polynesian cultures where there is a taboo against thinking about other people's mental states where they don't pass this task till they're like 8, for example. Deaf individuals whose parents don't sign and they acquire grammatically complex language in a delayed time also don't pass it till 7 or 8 years of age. So a lot of variability there. But, and here's the big paradox of developmental social cognition right now. The nonverbal based versions although there's a lot of controversy interpreting these experiments, are passed by 50-month-olds, according to René Baillargeon, for example. So here's a classic example of the nonverbal version. Basically, this is the same as the verbal version, but then you show the child, the 50-month-old, two potential endings, where in one case the ignorant agent goes for where the object is, and the other case the ignorant agent goes for where the object was left when she last saw it, and the infants look longer at the case where she knows where it is. Okay, so that's the infants. If you take looking time to show violation of expectations, surprise, right? The infants know that she's not going to know where the thing is, right? Even at 15 months. But then you look at these ones, and they don't know, right? So there's a huge literature now being generated about trying to explain this paradox. One is, oh, these infants, they don't really have a theory of mind, they're just using subtle behavioral cues. Another one is, no, they have a mature theory of mind, but they have immature executive control. So they can't, a 3-year-old, for example, knows that she shouldn't go there, but they can't articulate it because it requires some kind of inhibition that they're not capable of doing. And then my favorite theory, there are two systems of theory of mind. There's a minimal system that's online with infants, but then there's a system that comes online at age 4, which adults also use. Okay, so those are at least 3 approaches. Now, what do I want to say about this? Well, look at the minimal theory of mind. This is Butterfield and Apperly from 2013. And the cool thing about this is that what the infants are attributing in minimal theory mind are largely relations. They're not attributing internal, unobservable states with causal powers. They're attributing relations between the infants and distal objects. He calls these relations, or they call these relations, encounterings, goals, and registrations. So encountering is just when an infant has a line of sight on an object, when the agent the infant is trying to predict has a line of sight on an object, that's an encountering. A goal is just a future state that the agent being interpreted comes to stop at in the most efficient possible way. That's all a goal is. So these are entirely definable in terms of relations between the agent and the object they're moving towards, right? They're not internal causally potent states like beliefs and desires. Registrations are internal states. They're derived from encountering. So a registration is basically where the object was the last time the agent encountered it. Okay? So the object might have moved since then, but if the agent is driven by his registration, they're driven by this outdated information. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a registration. But there are these signature limits. So for example, they're very specific that these three kinds of states, relational states, are only minimally holistically constrained, okay? Unlike beliefs, which will yield different behaviors when they combine with indefinitely different ways with other beliefs and desires, these have a very limited range of combinatorial possibilities. And no opacity, I'm not going to get into this, I don't have time, but those of you familiar with this literature will know, Lois Lane can believe Clark Kent is at the door without believing Superman's at the door. That's a feature of high-level belief attribution that you have to understand the agent can describe the same object in two different ways, right? And that's something that doesn't appear in children until they're like 6 or 7. Even those that pass the standard false belief test don't understand that. So these things are purely transparent relations between agents and objects. There's no opacity. Okay, so that's one way of explaining this infant data, which doesn't treat theory of mind in that full-blooded philosophy of science sense as some kind of internal domain of unobservable, causally potent states. It's a set of relations between the agent and observable states of the environment. Another famous approach here is the teleological stance, which is Gergely and Shibra's idea that infants from a very young age assume that objects will pick the shortest, most efficient path towards a goal. So just if you look at the top one, they observe the yellow ball jump over the barrier, and then you present the infants with two possible other things, and they will look longer on the left one, the incompatible outcome. And so what that shows is they're not predicting the behavior of the yellow ball based on its actual trajectory. They're predicting it based on the fact that it takes the most efficient route to its goal, whatever that goal is. Does that make sense? Okay. So that, again, is totally non-mentalistic. It's completely observable. The heuristic is just efficiency of a goal pursuit, basically. Okay.
Sure, but in that case, isn't the goal implicit?
The goal, yeah. I want to make a distinction, we can talk about this later, I want to make a distinction between having a goal and representing your goal. I think things can have goals without representing them, okay? I think all of this could be put together using a framework from Daniel Dennett, the intentional stance. Daniel Dennett's framework is often assumed to be an account of beliefs and desires, but he means something very weird by beliefs and desires. For him, beliefs and desires are not unobservable concrete causes. Rather, intentional stance enables you to discern an abstract pattern in which agents select rationally optimal method to their goals relative to the worldly states of which they're informed. And information, being informed by something, I think can be completely observable. If where you're looking, that's what you're informed of, for example. Okay? There's no need to talk about some kind of internal mental state. Okay, so my idea there is that you can explain a lot of the behavior that motivates theory of mind in the rich sense in terms of just the tracking of these abstract relational patterns. Okay, that's step one. Step two, though, it's still probably not enough to explain smooth interaction, especially the kind humans do, because often it's just not even clear what goals you have, even understood in this minimal way, or it's not clear what you've been informed by recently, right? I mean, we all went to different places to get our coffee, or at least I went to a different place. Maybe you all went to the same place, but we were informed by different things at that time, so how am I going to predict what you're going to do and all that? Okay, so my idea is, and this is something that I've written about, drawing on a concept from Matteo Mameli, a philosopher at University of London, and also inspired by Victoria McGeer, who's at Princeton, that humans rely not on a sophisticated theory of mind, but on practices of what I call mind shaping. And the idea is humans are great at social coordination because they have biologically unique mechanisms for shaping each other into competent coordination partners. I really like the idea of the teacher in the last talk, because that for me is a classic example of mind shaping. These are four phenomena I take to be unique forms of human mind shaping: over-imitation, natural pedagogy, norms enforced by reactive attitudes, and emulation of language-based ideal agents, like morally ideal agents or protagonists of narratives. But I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of these. Over-imitation is a really cool phenomenon. Seems to be humanly unique. You give chimpanzees and human children this monkey box. There's a way of getting a prize, retrieving a turtle or a turtle on ribbon, or for chimpanzees a grape or something. And then you show them at first 2 steps, and they both seem relevant. And both the chimpanzee and the human infant follow both the steps. They can learn the task. But then you remove the opaque cover, and it's immediately apparent that step 1 was irrelevant. In the next trial, what do the chimpanzees do? They ignore the first step. They're like, this is bullshit, I don't need to do this. I just need to do 2 steps. Every human infant always does the first step, even if they know it's completely irrelevant to the task. This is a robust result across cultures, across many age steps.
But I think it's normal.
Yeah, well, if you look at things from...
It's normal because the child respects the rules.
Right, but no, you can do this... right, exactly. But the child, even when the adult is out of the room and the child doesn't know it's being observed,
the child was never spoke with everyone.
even if they're not being observed, they know they're not being observed, they will still obsessively go over the... Now, some people link this to ritual, and there's all sorts of other explanations. Here's an example of over-imitation at 18 months of age. Famous case. You show the kid that turning on the light with the head. The kid can easily turn it on with his hand. No, it does it with his head. But it's different. There are different conditions where you can change the pattern of results, which I can talk about. So over-imitation is one way we make each other more alike and therefore better at coordinating. 2, natural pedagogy. With an infant, this is again work coming out of Central European University. When you make eye contact with an infant and then you move your gaze to a focal object, the infant will follow your gaze, and then everything you do with that focal object, the infant will then treat that as the rule for how to use that object. Okay, that's called natural pedagogy. It's pre-linguistic, it's transcultural, another form of mind shaping. And the final form I'm going to talk about is norms and reactive attitudes. This is P.F. Strawson, another famous philosopher in the 20th century. He was interested in given that we're all determined, why do we hold each other morally responsible? What's the point of that? If we're not free? And his idea was, well, there are these reactive attitudes we have, like blame. I overheard you talking about blame earlier. Blame, resentment, guilt is a kind of self-directed reactive attitude. These are sort of primitive things, and whether we're responsible or not, we take each other as being responsible, and that enforces certain norms. That teaches us how to act properly in our community, right? So we have this built-in aversion to behavioral expression of these, and that helps regulate behavior. Makes sense given the ultra-social evolutionary strategy that our ancestors pursued. There's this theory that, unlike other primates, we cooperate in large groups of individuals that we don't know personally. That's very weird. These kinds of reactive attitudes enforcing normative regimes would make sense of that. If you think about it, in human prehistory, on the savannah, rejection by your group was likely a death sentence. So sensitivity to cues of disapproval by our group mates would have been a very useful strategy. And there's even evidence that social rejection activates brain areas similar to physical pain. Okay, so that's another way we shape each other to be appropriate interactants. So what is my final proposal? Thanks for bearing with me. But maybe human sociocognitive ontogeny should be the model for developing AI that's able to interact with us. Maybe the key to building AIs is to recapitulate the ontogeny of human social competence. Start with AIs capable of tracking abstract rational patterns from the intentional stance. Evidence that 6-month-olds can do this. Build AIs capable of distinguishing between normatively sanctioned and unsanctioned behaviors. Evidence that 6-month-olds already distinguish between helpful and unhelpful agents and prefer helpful agents. Okay? Add capacities for over-imitation, seen as young as 14 months. Natural pedagogy as young as 12 months. Then you add these sensitivity to reactive attitudes, and you might get, out of that, you might get joint intentionality as human infants do by age 1, according to Tomasello and Carpenter. And you can have all that, get human-style interaction. I don't think you really need a theory mind, at least in the full-blooded sense, once you have all of these capacities. Okay, that's all. I think I went way too long, but apologies, but thank you.